Hello and welcome to another episode of My Pocket Psych, the podcast all about the psychology of the workplace. I'm Dr. Richard McKinnon, chartered psychologist and coach, and this is one of the episodes that constitutes part of our Thriving at Work series, which is all about aspects of well-being. And for those of you interested, you can find out much more about that by visiting worklifepsych.com/thriving at work. I'm joined today, though, by a new face on the podcast, and I'm delighted we were able to find the time to speak today. Kara Daly, it is lovely to see you. How are you doing?
I'm very good. Thanks, Richard. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Not at all. I was recommended to speak to you by someone who saw you speak at the Division of Occupational Psychology conference this year. And it's something really clicked with me. And I thought we need to get you on as part of this campaign around well-being at work to address a topic that's not really discussed when we talk about well-being in the workplace. And that's menopause. And this is something that you have researched specifically. So before we go any further, and because you can do a much better job than I can, would you mind introducing yourself and your research interest to the listeners and viewers?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So I'm probably best be described as an early careers psychologist. I've taken a bit of a career pivot recently. So I completed a master's in occupational psychology back in 21-22. And for my dissertation research, I explored perceptions of menopause in the workplace. And I've since worked with the excellent Gemma Pike, Victoria Clark, and Vanessa Beck. And we've evolved this into an academic paper that was actually published back in June in Qualitative Research in Organisations and Management. And our research was specifically looking to explore three key areas. So we wanted to look at how a woman experiencing menopause, specifically negative symptoms that are impacting her at work, was perceived in the workplace. And then how a manager was perceived as likely to respond to a disclosure of these symptoms and their impact at work. And then specifically if there was any difference in how participants perceived the likely response of a male versus a female manager to this scenario. So from that research and from the responses that we had from participants, we developed 4 themes. The first one being that menopause was perceived as a burden, and that was a burden for anyone, not just the woman experiencing the symptoms, but those colleagues and managers that she disclosed her symptoms to, or if she requested support and changes to her working patterns and practices, then the burden on colleagues of having to, for want of a better word, fill those gaps. Menopause was seen as something to manage, and quite specifically, it was seen as something that a woman has the responsibility of managing herself. And as part of this organisational support was perceived to kind of depend on factors like organisational culture and prior experience of managers, with male managers constructed as less likely to understand or less likely to provide support. Then we had this kind of third theme of menopause being presented as a woman's issue and something that doesn't belong in the workplace, doesn't have a place there. And then to bring it up slightly and end on a slightly more positive note, our fourth theme that kind of emerged was that for some participants, menopause was perceived actually as unlocking new life potential in a positive way.
There's a lot in there. And I think just that little snapshot reveals the complexity of this topic, this experience, and the fact that it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in a system in the workplace. I want to unpick all of that, but could we loop right back to the start? And let's start with a very basic and essential question. What is menopause? How do you describe it to people when you're discussing it?
Yeah, of course. So if we take it in its simplest medical terms, menopause refers to the time when you stop having your periods. Natural menopause specifically actually refers to a single day. So it's 12 months after a woman has experienced her last period. And that's, from a medical perspective, that's what we mean by menopause. So in the UK, the average age of a natural menopause is 51, but there's so much variation to this. So there's actually a kind of a normal bracket and the age range that it normally occurs between the ages of 45 and 54. But it does happen before that. And reaching menopause before the age of 45 is known as early menopause. And for women under 40, this is known as premature menopause, or it's sometimes referred to as premature ovarian insufficiency, or POI. And when it comes to age of menopause, there are genetic associations with age of menopause. So, for example, the age that my mum experienced it is a fairly good indicator of roughly when I might. But it's important, I think, to recognise that, menopause doesn't just occur naturally, and it can be triggered by surgery involving the ovaries, by cancer treatments, and by a range of underlying conditions. But it does have different stages for most women, especially those going through natural menopause. It doesn't suddenly happen overnight. So the ovaries gradually slow down over time before a woman's period stops. And that transition period is what's known as perimenopause. So that's that period leading up to that 1 day point that's menopause. That's the 12-month period after a woman stops having her periods. And then after that 12-month point, you're then in the post-menopause stage. Symptoms are highly likely to start before a woman's periods have stopped. So whilst she's in that perimenopausal phase, and they are likely to continue post-menopause. And there's such a variation in terms of length of time. They can last for months, but they can also last for years. And the typical timeline for symptoms lasting is such a wide bracket. It's put at 3 to 15 years for the likelihood of symptoms lasting. And symptoms affect a lot of women. I think it's roughly around 70% of women that will experience symptoms with their menopause. And there are over 30 recognised symptoms. And these can be physical or they can be psychological. And actually, they aren't always a direct result of the hormone changes that a woman's experiencing. Sometimes they can be more of a domino effect, with one symptom leading to another. But the most common symptoms that most people will have some familiarity with are things like hot flushes, night sweats, sleeping difficulties, anxiety, and things like loss of concentration.
Thank you for that explanation. And it just, I hope everyone will agree, illustrates the complexity of this experience. But not only is there a high percentage of women experiencing these symptoms that you mentioned, we're talking about it's half of humanity, basically, and at the same time, it's not a topic that if you stopped it, people on the street could give an explanation and would have that kind of understanding beyond a few tropes or stereotypes. This is partly why I want to speak with you today about this. One, because I think it's very clearly, while not an illness, it is a well-being issue. And something I've been really clear and keen to get across is that well-being isn't just the absence of illness. It's how we are psychologically, physically, and socially. Some of those symptoms you've described would be a nightmare if you had them for a few days. Yeah. And yet you're saying they can last a very long time.
Yeah. Yeah. And, and there's obviously things that can be, done. There's interventions and medication and different things work for different women, but it doesn't remove things completely. It can improve them, and there's no guarantee one way or another how long symptoms are or aren't going to last. So I think particularly when you're looking at it from a workplace perspective and you're thinking about organizations, and what they can and can't do, there are so many external factors that can also have an impact on a woman's experience of menopause, on top of, like you say, this just host of symptoms that will vary because they are by and large driven by the hormone changes that are happening. But those hormone changes aren't consistent. They will go up and down. So some days, some symptoms will present, some days no symptoms will present. A few months later, completely different symptoms might be presenting. So it can be quite unpredictable.
Another complexity factor in there. So as with most transitions in life, it's not a straight line from A to B. A number of these symptoms will be unpleasant in and of themselves, but I was interested to hear about the domino effect you mentioned there. We know that if our sleep is disturbed, it makes the next day more difficult on a whole range of factors, from decision making to concentration to emotional management. Life is tougher when we haven't had enough sleep,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And that's just
Absolutely.
one example of how these things spill over. So that perception that this is a women's issue that doesn't really belong in the workplace, I'd be keen to shoot that down really quickly, right? Because it
Yeah.
relates to someone's, at a very basic level, performance at
Yeah.
work and how well they feel while they're at work. So it's necessarily a workplace issue, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And it's not, and it's also something that doesn't exist in, exclusively in the menopause space. There are countless things that somebody could be dealing with that is having an impact on their sleep. And as you say, that is then rolling into their abilities and performance in the workplace and becomes a well-being issue. So that's something that I think I tend to talk about a lot when I chat to people about menopause. And this isn't me trying to diminish the focus on menopause, but I think what is really important to understand is, we're not asking organisations to consider this one alien concept in isolation. It has so many applicable impacts and experiences that people going through different things are also going to be experiencing and having to deal with in the workplace. We aren't perfectly neat, compartmentalized individuals. Humans are messy. That's what makes us fantastic, but that's what also makes life complex.
It really does. And it strikes me, and in reading about this and doing a little bit of preparation for our conversation, it struck me there's a huge overlap between the experience of menopause and the experience of employees living with a chronic health condition
Yeah.
in terms of visibility, invisibility, social acceptance and talking about it, the impact on just coping with every day, whether people feel supported or not, whether they're able to do what's expected of them. There's a whole list of things there. And it's not about diminishing one, but it's about demonstrating maybe that organizations they could hit two birds with one stone, to use a terrible phrase, if they applied this lens to work and were able to provide people with the flexibility they needed around whatever it is they're experiencing.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think in any of those cases, for me, one of the consistent kind of underlying threads to that is that you're going to have individuals who are probably having to self-advocate all of the time. And also if they're, and menopause is an example of this. Menopause has fairly recently been added to the school curriculum, but that is really recent. We're talking last couple of years. So if you
Wow.
haven't had those conversations with, a female figure in your life, whoever that might be, mom, carer, sister, aunt, whoever that might be, it isn't necessarily where women go with their thoughts when they might be experiencing these symptoms. So you've got that burden of education and then that burden of self-advocating that I think runs through all of those scenarios and examples that you've just talked about. And I think that anybody who's had to consistently advocate for themselves and battle for the things that they need will tell you that very quickly becomes an exhausting process.
On top of the impact of any symptoms you might be experiencing.
Yeah, quite.
So you've educated me in our previous conversations and in this one for recording about this topic. What are some of the really common myths and misconceptions you've encountered about menopause?
So I think there's probably three key kind of myths or misunderstandings that have stood out for me as I've, explored and understood more about menopause and also conducted research in the area. I think the first one for me is that it only happens to women in their 50s. There's this assumption, and there's these, we touched on it earlier, these stereotypes that play into, you hear the word menopause and people's minds go to a very specific image of a specific person. And actually, in the UK, approximately 1 in 100 women experience premature menopause before the age of 40, which isn't an insignificant number. There's also an assumption that symptoms won't be experienced until a woman is in her 50s. But in reality, there's a good chance that a woman will start to experience changes to her hormones in her 40s, which means some of those symptoms will be starting to creep in, and potentially you'll see, as we talked about with the age range, a woman's actually in that perimenopausal phase. So yeah, that's my top one, I would say. The second one for me is that menopause symptoms are permanent. There's this view that once it happens, that's it. Admittedly, in some cases, they can last for a long time, but they're certainly not permanent, and they can be significantly improved by treatment and interventions. But I think I've, encountered and seen scenarios and examples where, an individual is written off because, that's it. They've hit menopause now. That's it. That's them. That's their label. And then the third one, and this one is specific to the workplace, that menopause is incompatible with possible intersecting career stages like senior leadership positions, because these dominant stereotypes we still see of a leader don't match up to those dominant stereotypes that we still see of a woman who's experiencing menopause.
All of those you can see as being quite pernicious and difficult to shift because they're easy. They're very simplistic views of something. And you could also see how they will impact a woman's experience of life, but of the workplace, which is what we're particularly interested in.
Yeah.
In addition to those symptoms that you've outlined, and as I understand it, there's many more that a woman could possibly experience, and to varying degrees at varying times. But in addition to those, what else is it about menopause that could impact a woman's experience of the workplace?
Oh, I mean, there's so many different things, and there's so many different ways, and this comes from internally perceived views and external factors as well. So, from what we know that's already out there, we know that women perceive their symptoms as negatively impacting their job performance and their workability, and that's regardless of whether they actually are or not. They just hold those perceptions. And we know that symptoms can lead to a woman exiting the workforce. So there's research using data from the National Child Development Survey that found that women who experienced one severe symptom at the age of 50 were more likely to have reduced their hours or left their job entirely by the age of 55 compared to a woman who wasn't experiencing severe symptoms. We also see that women report feeling responsible for presenting themselves as fit for purpose in a work context. But alongside that, we have common performance management practices that assess this fitness for work, such as ongoing and scores-based procedures that can actually increase the potential for negative career consequences. Because, as we've already said, menopause symptoms can be unpredictable, and that increases the likelihood of a woman needing to take, repeated short absences from work, which in turn, in those kind of performance management practices, can lead to lower scores and, potential disciplinary action even. We've also got fear and loss playing a really big part here. So women report fearing a negative impact on their career. They fear negative perceptions that others might have of them and of their abilities being called into question. And these can all lead to a woman avoiding disclosure of menopause at work and potentially not asking for support when they actually really need it. And actually, we've seen in the research that some women report working really hard to not only do their job, but to also manage their symptoms and any impact those symptoms might be having on their career. They find their own ways to counter perceptions of underperformance, again, rather than asking for support or adjustments that they may need. And we've got identity loss playing a part here as well as an important factor. So we have women reporting, feelings of lost identity. within the literature and the research, women have been found to engage in something that the research has coined as menopause talk, which is this fearful, negative, and self-depreciating, like menopause-related identity talk. And women use this to describe themselves, but also how they think they're being perceived by their colleagues. This potentially then plays into, this next point, that we find that women are less likely to disclose any difficulties they might be experiencing and things that are impacting them at work to male managers and to younger managers. And specifically, this non-disclosure to male managers is driven by this fear of gendered ageism, or of losing credibility the minute they highlight their status as a menopausal woman. So again, there's a broad range of issues interplaying there that can really have such a significant impact, on a woman's experience in the workplace.
And if we turn this around to which I would, want listeners who are leaders to do, turn this around, there's the impact of loss of talent. There's the loss of productivity. There's the loss of the contribution these employees make. That's a very, more selfish perspective, but it's really important because I've recently read many examples of how illness-based presenteeism leads to lower productivity and puts a real dent, because here in the UK, people are far less likely to take sick leave than elsewhere in Europe because of the fearful, what are the consequences of me being absent?
Yeah.
And so multiply that by the number of women experiencing these symptoms and non-disclosing. We potentially also have a skew in the data that says, oh, look how many people are off with back pain or the flu, when it's none of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're quite right with, linking that there to this fear, I think, for want of a better way of putting it, of taking time off. And that goes, beyond menopause, just, sick leave for any reason. And it's so ingrained in us. So, talking to a friend the other day who's got young children and who are now of school age, the school can give out awards for children that have not had any days off throughout the year. And you see workplaces do that as well. So from a really young age, we have these ideas and perceptions reinforced that it's not okay to be ill, and to recognize that you can't work or you can't do something for a particular reason because you're ill or you're dealing with something that has impacted your ability. And you can just see that reinforced here, I think.
Absolutely. And we've got then, building on what people might be aware of in terms of there are physical symptoms associated with this transition. They come and go, they peak and trough, but they might recognize that narrative. But there's the psychological component to this, which to me, I don't think people are as familiar with. The dent in confidence, the impact on self-concept and how I see myself, how I talk about myself. And that too is very impactful. What we buy into in terms of the stories about ourselves impacts our decision-making and our behavior, could in part explain exit from the workplace, but also explain that pedaling faster. Let me work even harder to somehow hide this or show that I'm still making a contribution, whatever that is.
Yeah, completely. And it's, I wasn't surprised by, the interwoven nature of identity through this, but I think it still stopped me in my tracks when I really started to engage with the menopause literature and my own research. And it made me think about it from because there's so many different perspectives, there's so many things that make us who we are, but for so many of us, our careers are such a huge part of that. So for something like menopause to come along and have such an impact on so many parts of a person's identity, because it doesn't just impact them in the workplace, but it's dealing with that ripple effect of of the impact across, all the different facets of who you are.
Yeah. And I'll link in the show notes to our kind of recent episode about self-concept and the importance of having a flexibility of our self-concept. The trap we can fall into is a kind of a rules-based system, or overemphasizing one aspect of us to the detriment of others. And that can lead to that overwork, that fear of disclosure, because if I see myself as this, anything that challenges this is a bad thing.
Yeah.
As opposed to how can we flexibly navigate this period of time rather than it's on, it's off. And very few of our biological experiences are like flicking a switch, are they? Really, they're kind of messy and unpredictable. This is another one. But unlike getting a sick note from a doctor, this is something that may not be discussed, will last much longer potentially, and have the psychological as well as the physical impact on a woman in the workplace. I'd like to shift gears and maybe look at a more positive perspective.
Yeah.
Because we know what can help. So what would you like managers and organizations to consider and to do differently for their employees who inevitably will have some form of menopause experience?
So I think for me, first and foremost, education is key. Organizational leaders should be, they should be looking to educate themselves. They should be looking to educate their line managers on the basics of menopause, like just as a starting place. If they don't already have that knowledge, if their line managers don't already have that knowledge, start there. And and that's something that's that is supported by existing research that we see in this area, which suggests that organizations should provide menopause awareness training for their managers, and they should have appropriate policies in place so that everybody, employees and managers, know the parameters within which they're operating. And so women are better supported to deal with their negative menopause symptoms in a way that enables them to continue working. And actually, there are some really brilliant courses available, some of which are free. And they provide that really great founding base knowledge of menopause alongside things organisations can be doing to provide appropriate support. And I think we're going to share some links to
Absolutely
some of these resources as part of this episode.
Yeah.
On top of that, I think organisations shouldn't underestimate the value of creating safe spaces for open conversations. I think that can be really important and a really powerful tool as well. Somewhere for those with lived experience to have those comfortable conversations with others, but also somewhere for those who want to be an ally but aren't yet sure what space is appropriate for them to be a part of. Give those people, an opportunity to be part of the conversation if they want to be.
It strikes me there's a big overlap here again with the kind of reasonable adjustments organizations could make for someone living with a chronic health condition, and to empower managers to make those ad hoc, work from home this morning, or come in later today. Miss, you don't have to get on a crowded train first thing, come in a bit later, or leave earlier today for whatever reason. Rather than permanent job redesign, it's that sort of sensible adult to adult conversation that can make all the difference for someone.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a little bit of common sense, and I get that there are certain roles that won't necessarily support that flexibility, but then, it's other things. Are you leadership position in an organization where your employees have a uniform? What's that uniform like? For somebody who's potentially experiencing hot flashes, is there some really small tweaks that you can make, or a slight relaxing of the rules for someone that can just make them infinitely more comfortable in the workplace and more able to carry out their role by a tiny adjustment that isn't going to have a negative impact on the masses, but is likely to have a huge positive impact on, the individual that you're making those adjustments for. It's, it can be such a small thing, but it can make such a
That's a
huge
great
difference.
example. I had this discussion a year ago on a plane. I won't name the airline, but they have recently redesigned cabin crews uniforms. And I was just chatting with a female member of the crew who said they look nice, but they feel awful.
Yeah.
There's no give. They don't forgive at all. They're constricting. And she said, and I sweat when I wear it. And I remember thinking, if I had to go to work every day in a uniform that was uncomfortable while doing a demanding job, I'd be pretty miserable.
Yeah.
And yet that's something completely in the control of an organization.
Yeah. And you're not setting your employees up to deliver to the best of their ability. You're not creating, like you say, it's such a simple thing to address and change that has organizational benefits. If you want to come at it from that business perspective, you're ensuring that you are setting your employees up to perform to their absolute best. If at the very least you're giving them a uniform that they feel comfortable in and physically able to do their job.
Exactly. And then things like in the organization, there being a sense of psychological safety to have those conversations as and when they're needed, to ensure to the same extent, and it's a positive, it's not a criticism, the same extent to which many organizations have invested in mental health awareness and parental flexibility awareness, and all of these other facets of that make us who we are. But this seems to be a bit of a blind spot despite the massive population that it impacts.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it to me, it links to what you see, particularly in research that's out there, widely regarded as the taboo of the 3 M's. You have menstruation, you have maternity, and you have menopause. And I think we're still in a space where, to a certain extent, they are presented as things that aren't appropriate to be talked about or recognised or considered. But the fact of the matter is, all of those 3 things have the ability to have an impact on someone in a negative way, in a work environment, but they don't have to.
I think that's a key message here. With all of these well-being topics, they needn't have a disastrous outcome or a negative ongoing experience for someone. If the culture, if the environment, if the managers can be upskilled and made aware, and if people can be encouraged to speak up and get that flexibility, it can make a huge difference. And again, flipping it around, you've got that dedication to the organization and all of those skills and that capacity being used instead of higher turnover and reputational damage and amazing people being lost to the workforce, which is something no economy can afford, really.
No, absolutely. The loss of high quality people is just, that to me, should be a pretty significant driving factor. You don't lose good, especially not if there are some fairly simple adjustments that you can make to ensure that you don't.
Absolutely. It repays multiple times over, as do most quality well-being initiatives. You get multiples back of every pound, every euro you invest in these things. I mean, it's terrible to have to talk business case all the time about something, but it's about, there are different perspectives to this, and that's definitely one. But there's another perspective, which is it's a good thing to do because we're human beings at work. So, Kara, to bring this to a close, I'd love if you could share with our listeners and viewers one thing you wish more people understood about menopause.
So for me, I think it's probably something that we've touched on briefly already earlier around self-advocating and having to self-advocate and how exhausting that can be. And the fact that this is a lived experience for so many women who are going through menopause. So there was some research conducted by Newton Health with 5,000 women who were surveyed, and they found that a third of those women had waited at least 3 years for a correct diagnosis of their symptoms as menopause. And then 18% of those had visited their doctor 6 times before getting the help that they need. So women can encounter really significant barriers in receiving a menopause diagnosis and then getting the medical support that they might need. They might be having to research their symptoms themselves, educate themselves, recognizing themselves that their symptoms might be an indication of perimenopause, and then arming themselves with the information and guidance that's available to them on menopause to advocate for themselves when seeing their doctor. And on top of this, once a diagnosis is received, it can be quite a long process to find the right balance of medication. Then medication availability can also become a factor. Specifically over the last few years, we've seen quite serious shortages of HRT in the UK. So potentially before a woman even gets to the point of speaking to her workplace about adjustments that she might need to help her manage her symptoms whilst working, she's already been through or might still be going through years of self-advocating and self-education. So for me, I think this is a really important point for organisational leaders to be aware of when they're thinking about what they can do to provide support and how easy and clear and simple that they can make this for someone who has potentially already spent years jumping through the various hoops of the medical system to even get to the point of having a diagnosis and knowing what's going on with them.
Really important point. Absolutely. And again, illustrating the complexity of the topic and the experience of a woman going through this. It's not just about the workplace, but that's what we're particularly interested in. Kara, thank you so much for your time today. You've kindly shared with me a whole bunch of resources that I'm going to add to the show notes. I'd encourage people encountering this for the first time, this topic, to get in touch with your questions. You can email us at podcast@worklifepsych.com. I'd be delighted to maybe, with Kara's assistance, answer those questions. I'm definitely not the subject matter expert here, but please do get in touch with your questions or thoughts on the topic. We love to hear from those of you who are listening and watching, of course. So thanks again, Kara, and for everyone else, thank you for listening.